Welcome to this episode of Life Science Success. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm a digital marketer in life sciences. And so, with that, let me bring in my guest. My guest today is Dr. Seth Toback. He is the Chief Medical Officer at ARMR and a board certified physician scientist with over 20 years of experience leading clinical development and medical affairs across biotech, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, infectious disease, and respiratory medicine. So, with that, welcome, Seth. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Don. It's great to be here, and I'm going to break out and tell you that it's ARMR, so it's not ARMR. So
I
excuse me
appreciate
for
that.
interrupting you right at the start of this, but ARMR is probably how you pronounce it. So
Excellent. Oh, that's great. I appreciate that because I would have continued to do that throughout the interview.
I'm
So
sure, and I would have shook my head every time. It would show on your podcast. So let's not do that.
I appreciate that. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what was it that your experiences first drew you to medicine, science, and then ultimately to vaccine development?
Yeah, so I used to watch a lot of cartoons as a kid. Everything from Scooby Doo to Underdog, and there was always this mad scientist character, and I always wanted to be that mad scientist. And as I grew up, I found out that mad scientist was actually not a real career option, so I opted for medicine. And so I went to medical school. I really enjoyed it there, and to my surprise, I found that I really love working with children. I found them to be strong and resilient, and so I chose my specialty in pediatrics. And during that time, I had a chance to really see a little bit of the opioid crisis firsthand by treating the youngest victims of this crisis, really babies that were born addicted to opioids, and their first experience in life was withdrawal. And at that time, I didn't have the tools to, really treat anything beyond the patient in front of me. And so, after working in a regular office for a number of years, I transitioned into industry with hoping that I could maybe work in a level that I could maybe treat patients, from the 10,000 foot level. Instead of treating one patient at a time, I could treat, many, many patients. And that's how I kind of got stuck working in industry. Working with vaccines was kind of a normal extension of being a pediatrician because pediatricians are generally vaccine experts. And so for most of my career, I've worked in infectious diseases. I'd say at least half that in vaccines. And that's how I ended up at ARMR Sciences. They were looking for a vaccinologist. And I was really excited about the potential. And so I joined them. And that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, so can you just share with us a few of the milestones that you had along the way? Because I feel like there's this long journey that you had, right? You spent two
Mhm.
decades working across vaccines, infectious diseases, and respiratory medicine. What were some of those defining moments in your transition from clinical or academic medicine into biotechnology?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've worked in medium to large size companies. This is my first startup, but I think some people would say this is a misfortune. I would say it was a fortune that I was lucky enough to be working in vaccines during the last two pandemics. I think it was a good timing in history to have two pandemics in a short period of time, so I could be working for both of them. I was working with influenza vaccine during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, and the vaccine we were working on was really one of the first ones to get to Americans during that entire crisis. And it was used a lot, actually preferentially by children. So I was able to really fulfill kind of my industry mandate as a pediatrician to go out there and protect children. And of course, the other large pandemic was the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And again, I was working with a vaccine and a company that was really, it was quite small at the time. We were able to grow it, and we were able to write this protocol, complicated protocol, work with different collaborators around the globe, and get a vaccine out in under a year. So for me, those are probably the two standout activities in my career.
And I mean, I don't like to talk about it as if it's a bad or a good thing, but because COVID for a lot of us, impacted a lot of people as well. But I mean, from a vaccine standpoint, was it beneficial to have that capability and the need to accelerate?
Well, the COVID vaccine in general, most people working on it were standing on the shoulders of giants. So there was a lot of work that was done beforehand. So people think that we actually did this stuff really, really fast. If you remember, we had SARS 1 And so a lot of companies had worked on SARS one and had a platform in place. So we were able to make it fast. But some of the things that sped us up was strong leadership, but also it was the government and the FDA really making sure they gave you special attention. They really listened to you. They would answer your phone calls when you called them. That doesn't happen in a normal situation. So I think we did a really nice job of coming together as a country to get this problem solved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's an interesting time because I was at a diagnostic company at the time, and the clients were telling us, "Look, we want patient samples. We don't want any
Hmm.
COVID positive patient samples." We didn't have a diagnostic at the time for COVID, so you couldn't even target exactly what the disease was. So how are you gonna find it if you can't there isn't a way to target it? So and then at the same time I was working with another vaccine, larger vaccine company, and they were saying, hey, look, there's all this other data that we have. We're just going to extract that and see if that works. And lo and behold, all of you seem to be on that same path pretty quick.
Yeah, it was a good time. I mean, the U.S. government did pick. They went through a pretty complicated process for looking at the best companies with either competing technologies, protein based, mRNA, viral vector, and they funded different ones. But back then, there was I think literally hundreds of companies that were vying to make a vaccine. Only a handful got funded, and only a handful came to fruition. So even though maybe in retrospect it looked easy, it wasn't that easy.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about your time at Novavax. So you played a really critical role there. What did that experience teach you about leading clinical programs during a global health crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. Leadership at that time was really challenging. I think the first one would probably be the concept that the leader brings the weather. So if you walk into a room and you're tense and you're nervous and you're frustrated, that is picked up by the team. So you really have to remember that when you're working so fast, you're under the gun, your stress level really radiates to the rest of the room. So you have to bring that calm even on days that you don't have it. So that's probably one thing. Another thing is, we work with a group of people where you have to, get that phrase, "This is not my job," out of your vocabulary, because everyone, including the leader, was doing every job. I mean, I was the team leader, but I was, writing the abstracts, writing the papers, doing the busy works, editing the protocol. So it's everyone's job. The people that were, not comfortable leaving their lane, those are the ones that were slowing down the team quite a bit. And then I think, finally, you had to make sure that you thought of this the entire thing as a endurance sport. This was not a sprint, even though it felt like a sprint. I think the team leaders that really paced themselves, as much as we were going fast, but paced themselves and paced their teams to make sure there was no burnout with the ones that were most successful. So that was really an important thing I learned.
Yeah, it's that last one is a very important thing, as especially, I mean, whenever you have critical submissions or you have critical, deadlines that you have to work through. I mean, obviously all of us face that at one point in time, but again, if we treat it as, hey, look, this is the next milestone in the marathon, we just got to get from here to there. Let's just focus on that.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, tell me a little bit about Armor, and what is its mission and the problem that you're attempting to solve with the fentanyl vaccine.
Yeah, ARMR Sciences is a biotech company. It was co-founded by our current CEO, Colin Gage, because he had personal experience with loss and really was seeking, anything that could be more proactive in the fight against the opioid crisis. I think our mission would basically be to slow down or stop overdoses in the U.S. and around the globe. I think, in terms of the problem, how is the problem defined? As a pediatrician, I had to go back and look at the details of the opioid crisis. I mean, we all lived through it, but there's actually three distinct waves. There was the early wave in the 90s with the OxyContin. There was the second wave with increased use of fentanyl. And now what we're working on is the third wave. And this is the third most deadly wave. It's the synthetic opioid wave, and then centered on fentanyl. So fentanyl, for those that don't know, it's manufactured. So it's called a synthetic opioid. It's about 100 times more potent than morphine, and it currently is the most dangerous drug in history. It's infiltrating all aspects of the illicit drug supply. So whether you're using heroin and there's fentanyl in it, or you're not even trying to use an opioid, maybe you like stimulants and you're buying a stimulant, there could be fentanyl in there, and even there's counterfeit pills out there. So even if you think you're buying a ADHD medicine or a Xanax on Snapchat or some other app, there could be fentanyl in there. So it's snuck its way into the illicit drug supply and other counterfeit pills, and it's causing this unprecedented third wave of the opioid crisis. And that's what we're working on. Currently, the opioid crisis is treated in a kind of reactive way. They have medications that help reverse overdoses. We want to be more proactive with this vaccine. We want this vaccine to be available on board at the time of an overdose.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this
Mhm.
as we went through our prep for the interview. Can you tell me a little bit about how it's designed to work, and then also, how does it impact other opioid pain medications or interfere with medications used for anesthesia?
Yeah, our vaccine actually isn't that much different than other vaccines. It's against a small molecule, so that's a little bit new. But they use a technology that's been used in a lot of other vaccines, including the pneumococcal vaccine or the meningococcal vaccine. What they do is they take a molecule that might be too small to be recognized by the immune system, like fentanyl, it's a very small molecule. They combine it with a larger molecule called a carrier protein. And those two together form the process of the vaccine that trains the body to create anti-fentanyl antibodies. So if your body ever sees fentanyl again, it can find it in the bloodstream, it can bind it and stop it from doing what it does, which is bind to receptors in the brain and stop you from breathing. That's a very common way that all vaccines work, but we just use it in a little bit different way. Um, and then, why the reason it works so specifically? That's the nature of an antibody. I mean, antibodies against flu work against flu. They don't work against RSV or adenovirus. It's very specific. So it'll work against fentanyl and fentanyl only. Maybe some of the very similar analogs. There are a couple chemists out there that are very savvy and are trying to change the fentanyl molecule to make it not illegal, but it's very, very similar. So it might work for those. But in general, it should therefore not interfere with other pain medicines like morphine, like codeine, hydroxycodone, all the ones that you might get from your dentist or from your doctor or even an emergency room.
So critically important, and we talked about this as well, that you could foresee like either a healthcare provider or a emergency care provider, you needing things like this so that they don't get impacted just in their day-to-day job as well.
Yeah, we think there's a couple different audiences for this vaccine, and one of them are those that are at occupational risk for exposure to fentanyl. And so there hasn't been a ton of documented cases, but there is a lot of literature that shows that first line responders, EMS, firemen, police, are concerned about that, getting in touch with fentanyl on their daily basis, whether it be doing CPR on a person who might have fentanyl around their nose or mouth, or whether it be a criminal and the police officer has to tackle them, put some cuffs on them. This has been a real concern. There was an episode in the news that was about 3-4 weeks ago in New Mexico where the entire EMS force, this small town, was decontaminated for hours. So imagine if you were a person having a heart attack at the time when the entire EMS team was in the ER being decontaminated. So there are functional and operational parameters that are impacted too, even if they're not, truly causing death or morbidity in your first responders. There is a impact to their ability to do their job.
Yeah, so important. Let's talk a little bit about your phase 1/2 study. It uses a human challenge model with carefully controlled medicinal fentanyl dosing and
Mhm.
respiratory monitoring. How does that model work? And then what are the safeguards that are in place? And then how do respiratory patterns help you measure the vaccine efficacy in real life?
This is probably one of the most innovative aspects of our entire program. So I do infectious diseases, and it's pretty common to have challenge studies in infectious diseases. They take you to, a room with, you know, um, appropriate ventilation. They expose you to influenza or RSV, some other bacteria or virus, and they see if whatever drug or a vaccine prevents you from getting sick. So in our case, we follow a similar pattern. So we vaccinate people or give them placebo, and then we expose them to a very measured dose of fentanyl, medicinal grade fentanyl, as you said, but it's under very controlled circumstances. So it's in a room very akin to an operating theater. So you have all the machinery, you have all the monitoring equipment, all the safety equipment, and it's also under the supervision of an anesthesiologist. So someone like me, I don't like putting people to sleep, but basically anesthesiologists, they don't start their job until someone goes to sleep. So for them, this is actually fairly old hat to them. So they give them this medicine and then they watch their respiratory pattern. Now, fentanyl, the way it hurts people is it slows down your respiratory pattern. It makes you breathe, slower or more shallowly, and they can measure that with a face mask. And so they're looking at the respiratory rate, looking for how deep you inspire, and looking at it in real time on a curve. So you're seeing a little curve moving along, and they're looking to see that drop, which fentanyl will typically do. And if they don't see that drop, they know that the vaccine is doing its job.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the endpoints and biomarkers. What endpoints and biomarkers will tell you whether the vaccine's working, and then how might real world evidence eventually complement what you learned through controlled clinical trials?
Yeah. So first of all, the most classic biomarker for any vaccine trial is the antibodies. So you measure how much antibodies are present after vaccination, whether it's one dose or two doses. In our case, it's going to be after the second dose. And you measure how high that is. That's called the titer. And that's really the most classic biomarker for a vaccine response. It's a titer. And then in this case, we're going to see which titer then corresponds to the clinical outcome of interest, which is not having your respiration rate decrease with fentanyl. So if they can say, aha, those that were prevented from having a drop in the respiratory rate had a titer of X, that's your clinical endpoint, and that X titer is your protective titer, or sometimes we call it a correlate of protection, and that's our major biomarker. And so we're going to be definitely utilizing that concept. In terms of real-world studies, we might have, after authorization, some post-marketing studies. This is where it really gets fun. You can really start to look at the real use of fentanyl out there. So you can look at different populations and study real-world endpoints. So you could look at those that are suffering from opioid use disorder and see if they have a decrease in true fatal or non-fatal overdoses. You can also look at larger populations that might use it, like young adults that are at risk from experiencing adulterated drugs in the illicit drug market, or people that are exposed inadvertently, thinking, again, as I mentioned before, buying a different medicine and getting a counterfeit pill. So you can look at the reduction in those rates, and also you can look at the reduction of rates in your occupational exposure populations too. So that's really where the rubber meets the road in the real world.
Perfect. And in terms of the misconceptions that are out there, you and I talked a little bit about the fact that some
Yeah.
people misunderstand what this is supposed to target. Can you share with the audience just a little bit more of that?
Yeah, so a couple of misconceptions. So the first one is people are always worried that's not going to work with Narcan. And this goes back to the conversation we had before. Narcan is just, or naloxone is the medicine that's used to treat overdose at the time. So it works by blocking the receptors in the brain. And so the way that our vaccine works is far upstream. It actually works on blocking fentanyl in the bloodstream even before it gets to the brain. And it touches back on that idea of the specificity. So the antibodies are going to block fentanyl and fentanyl only. Narcan is a different chemical structure, so there's absolutely no reason it shouldn't. It should block Narcan. In fact, it'll probably work better together because you'll have the Narcan blocking at the brain level. You'll have the vaccine stopping the levels in the blood, and therefore both of them working together to bring down both levels at the same time. So that's one thing. It shouldn't do that. It also shouldn't impact the drugs that are used to treat opioid withdrawal. So there are medicines like methadone, for example, which is used to treat withdrawal symptoms. Again, methadone is chemically distinct from fentanyl. There's no reason that a fentanyl vaccine producing anti-fentanyl antibodies would bind methadone or any of those medications. So that's a major one too that we hear a lot. I think the other thing we get questions about is it going to take fentanyl off the table forever? What if I need it for an emergency surgery? And even though we would love the vaccine to last a long time, it's most likely going to last for probably between 6 to 12 months. So it's not going to last this for forever. If you need an emergency medicine, you can get another medication. ER doctors have different choices. Anesthesiologists can pick different medicines for anesthesia. So it's not going to stop you from getting emergency care. And in that short half life too is actually working for 6 to 12 months is actually a benefit in some cases, because say you are using the vaccine and for an occupational reason. Say you're a border patrol agent and you're on the field. Maybe you like to get the vaccine, and now you get a promotion and you're working at a desk job. You just elect not to get the booster shot, and eventually you'll know that the titers will fall down and you'll have access to that fentanyl if you need it for emergency. Now, where it's a little more difficult is if you're using it for opioid use disorder, and really you want to use it for a long term to support them through their entire recovery. In theory, it would be nice if it lasted longer. In this case, you'll just have to make sure there are mechanisms in place to get those boosters at regular intervals to protect someone during their entire period of recovery. So those are probably the major ones. I think finally the last one will be, is this vaccine going to be mandated? Someone may be required to get that. And like all vaccines, there's a choice between the person receiving the vaccine to take the vaccine, and usually that choice is made with a discussion with their healthcare provider. So this vaccine will not be mandated; it will not be involuntarily given to people.
It's important, especially given, um, just the rumor mills that can run, right? I mean,
Sure.
I feel like it's important to cover. Um, what about the how would you respond to the concern about the fentanyl vaccine condoning drug use or create a false sense of security?
Yeah, this is one we hear a lot too. This concept has been around for a while. Actually, the term is called risk disinhibition. The idea that you're going to now do activities that you wouldn't do because you think you're protected. A good example is wearing a seatbelt. So people say, well, if you're wearing a seatbelt, maybe people are going to drive more recklessly. There is a lot of data that shows that this does not happen. Risky behaviors across the behavior spectrum for health are not increased due to a possible preventative function. So I think this is really, it's not a concern. Really what we want to do is protect people from having a fatal overdose. We want to take a fatal overdose and potentially turn it into a non-fatal overdose. And we also want to help people to potentially augment their recovery if they're suffering from opioid use disorder.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to understand, those methods. The You've said that you're passionate about translating scientific advances into impactful therapies for all patients. What does that mean in this context? And then what would success actually look like?
Yeah, I think success would be, seeing this vaccine make it out into the market. They have been working on small molecule vaccines since the 1970s. And so this is, again, it's not new, but it's new in that we're doing it now when we need it to fight the current opioid crisis. So people have been working on vaccines against heroin, against cocaine. There was even a company that was working on a vaccine against nicotine. None of them were successful. But I think right now we have the confluence of a couple different things. The science has gotten better. The endpoint that we're looking at is not preventing an addictive behavior. It's actually just preventing death or overdose. And so that should be, it takes out the human characteristics of behavioral changes. So it's a little bit more likely to hit. So I think we're looking at, a classic time period to have a first ever approved vaccine for a small molecule. So that would be a success in my mind. And then, the second hurdle is getting it to the right populations. So making sure that we conduct studies that show the evidence in the right populations so it's available to all those populations. So insurance companies will cover it for those that want it. And to make sure it's widely available to different populations and different locations. So we'd like to start with the U.S. and then hopefully make it around the globe for any person that needs it. That there are something like 45 to 50 million people around the globe that have opioid use disorder, and it could be used in any of those.
Wow. Um, so one of the last few questions that I have for you, and I'm going to change this one on you, just because
Okay,
of
sure.
the poster behind you. Who's your favorite Star Wars character?
Who's my favorite Star Wars character? I have to probably say Han Solo, just because he is the classic rogue. The classic. He holds the gun up and goes, "Hey!" So he's pretty cool. And the story behind these posters is, during COVID, I took over my media room to be my office, and then when we moved, I got so used to having them there, I just said, "You know what? The posters are coming with me."
That's funny. An ultimate great story to tie it all together. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Sure.
What inspires you?
I think what inspires me is the fact that I get to be a pediatrician and work in industry. So the two things that I've always wanted to do, and knowing that I'm taking the skill set that I used to use one on one with each patient to try and make each patient better, and now doing it from a much higher level to a much broader audience. So knowing that anything I work on could potentially impact thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of people. So that inspires me.
Oh, very nice. What concerns you?
I think my biggest concern would be, complacency. People say, we've got pretty good in this world, and if pretty good is good enough, people are not going to strive for better. And I think if you wake up every day and say, everything's fine, I'm not going to think, I'm not going to work to be better, innovation is going to suffer. And then when that happens, I think we suffer as humanity. So I think you need to wake up every morning and say, what can I do what's new, and what do I have now, and how can I make it better?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Last one. What excites you?
What excites me, I think, on a small level, what excites me, what I get most excited about in my job, and I'm going to, confess to being a complete nerd here, it's data. I love getting data. When I hear, oh, we're getting another little piece of this, or I'm getting a little graph here, I'm getting a big spreadsheet from Excel, I get so excited. Just knowing that every little bit is one more piece of the puzzle that brings the entire picture into clarity. And that clarity then leads to your product getting approved or authorized. That to me is exciting. So it's a little bit of a nerdy answer, but it's probably the most truthful answer I can give.
All right, Seth. Thank you for being a guest on the Life Science Success podcast. Before I conclude, though, are there any? What are the ways that people would get in touch with you, and what is the best way for people to find more information about Armor?
Probably the first start is look at our website. So it's armorsciences.com. You can also Google it. So we've got a couple articles that's one nice one came out by JAMA recently that really went through a lot of the questions that we were talking about, those misconceptions. I think if you use a search engine, you'll also find interviews with our CEO. He's been interviewed many times, and so you can see those great interviews. So that's probably the easiest way. We haven't published any of our data as of yet because our clinical trials are still ongoing. But I think if you were to do a sort of scientist as a PubMed search, you could look under a fentanyl vaccine and read about some of our preclinical work in mice, which is really exciting. So those are probably the best ways.
Excellent. Well, Seth, thank you so much for sharing the story. I really appreciate it. I appreciated hearing about Armor and the impact that you guys are currently working on having for fentanyl affected people. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Don, for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.